Without a doubt, a lot of things have happened in recent weeks. We've seen the attempted assassination of a former United States president. We've seen the Republican National Convention unfold, and then President Biden withdrawing at an unprecedentedly late time in his campaign for reelection. With the Democratic Party in upheaval, with the Olympics on the horizon, it's an interesting time to try and consider how to think biblically about current events. What I want us to do is not just analyze the surface level events, but I want us to see if we can figure out what is underlying these events so that we can think biblically from a standpoint that gives us the ability to make sense of all that's happening around us. That's today's Truth Currents. Almost everybody in America has seen the clip of the assassination attempt on Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago. Speaking in Pennsylvania, he was struck in the ear by a passing bullet from an attempted assassin who was eventually killed by Secret Service. There's been lots of drama for those events, the survival of the president, the failure of the Secret Service, this conspiracy theory or that conspiracy theory. It's been compounded with a Republican National Convention that seems to, in some ways, be moving away from social conservatives like Christians. On top of that, we've now seen the chaos that is consuming the Democratic Party as their candidate withdraws from the race for president at a date later than any withdrawal by an incumbent president in U.S. history. We're faced with the possibility of a candidate for president who will be nominated by a convention who has not received a single vote by another American in her campaign for presidency. In a sense, for all of the screaming about Donald Trump, it seems like the Democratic Party is the real threat to democracy here, but we'll get to those things. Let's talk about how we evaluate the rapid pace of current events swirling around us, how we look at these things from a biblical standpoint. It was interesting that Donald Trump, who talks often about faith, but not always in a way that is substantial enough to give me real confidence that he knows what he's talking about, and yet following that assassination attempt, Donald Trump himself clarified the issue by posting on Truth Social this statement: God alone prevented the unthinkable from happening. Indeed, it was God and God alone that did, in fact, as he always does, controls the events of human history, the unfolding drama that is all around us. But it was interesting for Donald Trump to acknowledge that there was, in his mind, an obvious explanation for his survival, and he put that credit at the foot of the throne of God. The reality of moral evil was sort of put on display for Americans in that event, because what we've seen is that there was an individual, at least an individual, who chose violence over the political process. Now, when things like that happen, it's interesting to observe the evaluations that come from Americans. What we've seen is that moral relativism, this idea that what's right for one person can be right for another person, it shows how ridiculous it is when you have these moments of moral clarity in the life of a nation. Because what we've seen is even among progressives, there is sort of a consensus that says this is not how we're supposed to do things. And you see, the very idea that the attempted assassination of a major political candidate in the middle of a presidential campaign, both sides have sort of come to the agreement that this is not acceptable. Well, you can't have that position that this is not acceptable unless you have some sort of immovable reference point by which you can evaluate morality. Now, granted, there have been a few people on the extreme left who have made humorous comments, made jokes. They've tried to play off of this lightly by saying things like, well, maybe the shooter won't miss next time. But they've been roundly condemned for those kinds of comments because we understand that morality is not some nebulous something that's up for grabs that you get to shape like a can of Play-Doh into whatever shape that you want it to be. Morality tells us that certain things should not happen, like the assassination of a political leader. There was an attempt on the part of this assassin to abandon politics and embrace violence. It was a premeditated attempt to undermine an entire civilization and to kill another human being. As a dimension of human activity, one of the things that we have to recognize is that politics brings out both the best and the worst in people, and often it's the worst that it brings out. And here's the reason. We tend to live in a generation today that views politics as the highest level of importance in the American experience. Because we have a secular society, even when tragedy happens or something outrageous like this happens, and even the secularists sort of gravitate to a position of morality that says this shouldn't happen this way. These things should not take place. Those are moral evaluations, and they don't really know why they come to that position, except they're hardwired to understand that that's the reality of it. But the problem typically is when you don't have a transcendent God that you answer to, politics substitutes as the highest level of importance in the human experience. So what that means is that for secularists, often their language degenerates into the language of supreme importance. I mean, for example, President Biden not too long ago used the language of putting a bullseye on President Trump. Well, that comment hasn't aged very well, obviously. But the fact, I'm encouraged by the fact that given these events, there has been from both sides of the aisle a demand for answers. The head of the Secret Service has been forced to resign because the Secret Service had a colossal failure in this event. And even on the left, there's an understanding that these things shouldn't be. We're driven to hold people accountable for their actions. That is another expression of the reality of objective morality that is hardwired into the way that we are created as human beings. Now, clearly, our political system is not well. But it's because we have in our secular society a people who see politics as the highest plane of human experience. And so they're increasingly desperate as they see the threat to their particular vision of the way America should be. And frankly, I see this on both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans. If politics is the be-all and end-all of human experience, then it's hard to justify anything as being out of bounds in order to achieve what you think is for the greater good. That's why an assassination attempt sort of jolts us back to the reality that there is something other than our standards that we need to be concerned with. Frankly, what we as Christians can do to help our nation understand what's happening is we can communicate that there is a higher plane than human politics, and it is the plane of acknowledging that there is a God who balances divine sovereignty with the accountability that comes from holding human beings responsible for their actions. Let me give you a couple of verses from the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 21. In Proverbs 21, verse 1, the writer says this: "The king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he pleases." In other words, political leaders are influenced by the purposes of God as God uses both good leaders and bad leaders to accomplish his unfolding drama that is intended for human history. The last verse of Proverbs chapter 21 is verse 31. It says, the horse is prepared for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord. In other words, as human beings, politically, we make plans and we develop strategies and we plan wars and we do all of these things. But at the end of the day, as Christians, we acknowledge that there is a sovereign God above the process. Now, the reason this is important is not only that we're a testimony to a culture that feels like things are spiraling out of control. We're a testimony that there is a God who is still in control. There is a God seated on a throne who is sovereign over human affairs. Now, we hold that position because it's critical in the life of a nation for us to acknowledge that God so that politics doesn't become the defining trait of everything that we happen. In tragedy, whether it's an attempted assassination or 9/11 or any of the moments that we can point to in the history of our nation, anytime there's a crisis or a tragedy, I find it interesting to look back historically and see that the nation that is sort of self-consciously secular most of the time, when we face a tragedy or a crisis, the nation turns to the church. In every national trial and tribulation, the American nation needs the church. You might recall, if you were an adult and around when 9/11 happened, you might remember that for weeks following that event, churches were full. People were drawn to church because they were looking for stability in a world that seemed to be out of control. They were looking for a reference point from which they could gain their bearings. They turned to the church. Now, it's true that those moments tend to dissipate and secularism reemerges as the dominant worldview of our culture. But yet, I want us to understand that it's important for us as the church to continue to be the church, the biblical expression of God's plan for the kingdom, because it's impossible for a nation ultimately to survive unless they have some sort of anchor of what you might call civic Christianity. Frankly, Christianity is, despite all of the propaganda that says we're not a Christian nation, the founding fathers were secularists, they weren't believers. The actual facts of history tell us differently. But Christianity is deeply embedded in the American experiment. And while it doesn't always put itself on display, it's crucial at times of particular uncertainty and upheaval, like we're experiencing in the summer of 2024. It's important for the church to represent the sovereignty of God well. The reality is, human individuals cannot bear tragedy in isolation. It is a natural response to crisis or tragedy for us to be drawn into community. The idea of rugged individualism that is so such a definition of being an American, that works under normal circumstances. You can sort of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and you can be your own man. But when things get really tough, what we discover is that secular platitudes are meaningless. You know, we live in a culture where people say, I'm sending you positive vibes. I'm thinking positive thoughts for you. Well, let me tell you something. That's worthless. We don't need vibes or thoughts. That gets you nothing. Atheism can offer no meaning to any particular event, no meaning outside of moral meaninglessness. They speak in terms of abstraction. Tragedy and emergency have a way of peeling off secularism's veneer of authority. What America needs this summer is not a particular presidential candidate. What America needs is a recognition that God is sovereign. They need the church to be the church. When Ronald Reagan survived an assassination attempt while he was president in the 1980s, he often spoke about that event later in his life by saying that the attempt on his life awakened him to the reality that he needed God every day. I'm praying that this attempt on Donald Trump's life will produce in him not merely a determination to run a harder race or a fire in the belly to pursue the presidency even more. What I'm praying is that brush with death will bring Donald Trump to the place where he says, I need God every day. If Donald Trump humbled himself before the throne of grace, if daily he placed himself in the hands of God and asked to be used, our nation could see something remarkable unfold. If that's ever to happen, if our country is to recover hope and redemption, where will it come from? It will come from the church being the church. So while you're caught up in the headlines and the events and you're in all of the conversations that are abuzz with things that are happening around us, don't forget maybe the most significant thing you can do is to start your morning by getting out of bed and presenting yourself before the throne of grace with an open Bible on the table in front of you and asking God to protect this nation, to work through His sovereignty, to overrule the crazy events of our time, to put a leader in the White House that He directs the heart of, so that our nation can once again be the people I believe God desires us to be. The Bible asks the question, if the foundations are destroyed, how will God's people be saved? We need to pray that the Christian foundations of our nation are once again strengthened, undergirded, and that we be the people we were meant to be as a nation because we see the church being the church in our land. It's up to us. We are the answer to the problem because we know the sovereign King. Let's call on Him. This is Truth Currents.